Greetings and hello to everyone. This is the Business of Betting podcast, and I'm your host, Jake Williams. Today is episode 28, and we have Dan Weston joining the show. Dan started out not as a sports bettor, but playing poker online. Following the changes in the poker world, Dan concentrated on sports and is the man behind tennis ratings. Dan uses statistical analysis to trade on tennis markets all around the world and provides premium content on his website, tennisratings.co.uk. This podcast is proudly sponsored by Betfair Proprietary Limited. Betfair operates a betting exchange and is licensed in the Northern Territory of Australia. The Betfair exchange isn't a house that sets the odds. It's betting at its purest. One punter's opinion against another's. Play the game within the game and join today. Residents of Australia can join Betfair by visiting betfair.com.au, and please support this podcast by using promo code BOBPOD. Gamble responsibly. As always, you can find us at businessofbetting.com or at bettingpod on Twitter. Please fire in any questions or feedback and potential guests you would like to hear from. So thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoy my chat with Dan Weston. Today I'm joined by Daniel Weston. Daniel, thank you very much for joining me.
Hey Jake, how you doing? Looking forward to this.
So Daniel, let's sort of get stuck into your background a little bit. Do you remember when your first bet was, or when you sort of started getting involved in betting?
Well, it depends which way you look at it really, in terms of an exact bet. So I guess like the first edge that I worked out was when I was probably before I was 10 years old, and used to go to the pier with my parents sometimes when we went to see grandparents lived in seaside towns, and worked out how to beat a couple of the fruit machines on the pier. And also there was a horse game that you could play. You could bet on the horses, but there was a big bug in the software, but whereby you could wait until halfway through the race before you could put a bet on. So maybe 10 years old or something like that, I worked out how to beat them. And although the jackpots weren't great, I was delighted to come away with like £15-20 profit in a short space of time. At that age was like I felt like a millionaire, you know. And funnily enough, later on in my life, when I left university, or sort of around there towards the end of my university degree, I learned how to play slots properly. And that was my real first introduction to sort of full-time gambling.
So through high school and university, were you at all focused on betting? Were you betting, on weekends or in your spare time, or were you just a regular student then and it was somewhere in the back of your mind that one day you might get into it?
No, I never really had a plan to do it. I used to like it because I felt like I would be able to exploit markets, if that makes sense. But I mean, I came really from when I was like 18, 19. I had like no background in it at all. I was doing a degree in accounting, so I guess I was pretty numbers orientated even from an early age. And I used just to go to bookies and bet horses and football and stuff, but really small stakes, like just because obviously I was a student, I couldn't afford much, and didn't really do very well. Made a lot of obviously the mistakes that a lot of newbies make, like betting on accumulators and stuff on a regular basis, which obviously never really came up. And on the racing, I was betting on like the place pot and stuff, which I didn't really understand how much the authorities take out of it from a profit margin perspective. So I lost a bit, but small stakes. I was a student, and then I met a guy who showed me how to play machines, and kind of went from there really. And I just from that onwards, I wasn't interested in the betting on football and stuff, because there was the fruit machines in the betting shop, so I could make money on them instead.
So when you say playing machines, I assume you mean slot machines or poker machines?
Yeah, they're slot machines. They don't really have poker machines so much in the UK. So basically, like in UK, at that stage, each bookmakers had 2 fruit machines in, and like pubs would have anything from like 1 to 5 or 6 machines in each pub. The majority of pubs would have them, and so you could only play like a certain range of them, like maybe 25% of the ones that are on the market. But obviously, if there's like, I mean, I went to university in Canterbury, so there was like probably 50 pubs within like a mile of in the city centre. So it doesn't take you long to work out like which pubs have got the right machines to play in, and then you've got a head start straight away, basically.
So in theory, those machines are, I guess, constructed to pay out less than, you know, a positive amount for the bettor. Is that what happens, or is there some way to beat them?
That's exactly it. So generally, like, they have a set percentage, which is 78% or around those ballparks. And so obviously, in theory, people will say, oh, well, if I put £100 in, I should get £78 out. Well, it doesn't really work like that, because there's massive short-term fluctuations in the percentage. So a machine might need to recoup percentage, which means it will take money off the gambler, or it may need to get back to its target percentage. So it will give a short-term boost to the player. And technically, the methodology would be that you would be able to identify the situations where the machine was in a position where it would need to give money to the player, and then you'd play it until you realise that the machine was no longer in that situation.
Okay.
So it works on the target percentage works on a lot longer basis. So you might have, like, if you put like 10,000 in, you'd get 7,800 out if you played it pretty optimally. But over the short term, it was much more wildly fluctuating.
So what about university? You mentioned accounting. Did you study accounting or finance, or did you do something else there?
Yeah, accounting and finance. Graduated with some savings, which was, it's positive. Not many students can do that based on my machine income. And then I was going to get a job with a firm of accountants, probably one of the just a graduate training program. I applied for quite a few of them, but the competition was really, really tough. Like, just even at the recruitment days, there'd be like 50 people competing for like several jobs, and that's they're only just to get to recruitment day was actually a pretty decent achievement in a lot of these companies. And whilst I was trying to get a job, I was still playing machines like whenever I had time, and was still doing well. And jobs weren't easy to find, so I thought, well, I'll give machines a go. Said to myself, right, I've got 6 months to see how it goes, and lasted about 10 years.
Wow.
Yeah.
And then how did you transition from there to what you're doing now? Was it you mentioned 10 years, but was it straight into it, or did you try other sports? How did you land on tennis?
What happened was then, like, machines, like, generally it was really decent, and the variance was so low that you would pretty much go home winning like close to average amount every single day. But it would go through stages where like the percentage of machines you could play would be fewer, and it'd be harder to find the ones that you wanted to play, and became a bit of a grind at times. And one of the guys that I knew from the circuit told me that one of his mates was making a ton of money playing online poker, because like the other opponents were just really, really bad. So I bought a couple of books. Probably learned some bad habits from reading the books, because the books primarily were focused upon like very long structured tournaments, as opposed to the cash games that I wanted to play online. But I found quite a few like online resources in the end, and pretty much taught myself from scratch how to play online poker, and like watching high stakes players videos, and constructing how they construct their decisions, forums, and then eventually I taught myself as well how to use poker software. Like, I was using Poker Tracker at the time, and the heads-up display was on there, and kind of taught myself how to work out who the bad players were and how their statistics managed to define their range of hands, and did pretty well playing online poker for a few years. And then all of a sudden it went downhill fast, because the US players got banned from depositing overnight. They called it Black Friday, and unfortunately only the bad players need to deposit, so it left only the good players. It became a bit of much more of a grind, and everyone's sort of taking money, all the regulars just taking money off the other regulars, and it wasn't nearly as lucrative. And then from there I decided to move into sports.
Interesting. So did you, when you were thinking about transitioning after Black Friday and spending a bit of time playing into those sort of tough tables, I would imagine, what was your mindset? Were you thinking, I want to get straight into tennis, I want to go to football, or what were some of the thoughts in developing a plan after that?
Yeah, absolutely. Everything I try and do, I always try and have a future plan. That's something that I've kind of put a lot of time into, and generally it's served me pretty well. With that, originally I looked at football primarily because I found that it was easy to get a lot of data. There were some good sites with data on, and also because as a fan I'm more into football as well. Unfortunately, I was a bit naive in the fact that I didn't really understand the fact that there was, or didn't know that there was people with considerably more experience and resources than me, who were able to be. That was they had the edge. I didn't have the edge, so I was did not do too well at football. But I was still playing machines a bit when to eke out a living as well. So I didn't really have a ton of financial pressure. And then I worked out that there was some good statistical resources on tennis online as well. So then I set about building a Elo model. So basically, obviously, the way that works is that a player would receive more credit for beating a good player than they would a bad player. And I built a model based on that, and that worked really well for ATP, WTA, and in particular challengers, because at that point bookmakers were really, really bad at pricing challengers, and they were often slow to react to market movements as well. So my ROI in challengers was really, really good compared to ATP and WTA. It was great, but problem with that obviously is that it leads to account restrictions. Even at that stage it wasn't that fast, but it still happened eventually, and so therefore I moved into more of a trading mindset.
I want to talk about building a model. A lot of people will send in questions about that or emails.
Okay.
If you haven't built a model before, people say, I have my algorithm and I have my model, or I run it through my computer. What does that actually mean? Does it mean, you can use an Excel spreadsheet and have a fair few variables and it can spit out a few numbers or ratings or things like that? Or is it much deeper than that and it requires a sophisticated computer program that requires an engineering background?
I think it could be either, really. I think that for my personal perspective, it would all be to do with what the inputs are. The inputs would have to be right. You could have the most expensive bells and whistles program that anyone could wish for, but if the inputs aren't right, you're still not going to come towards an accurate conclusion. So it's the inputs that are more key. I mean, my spreadsheet skills are pretty rudimentary, but I did a course on it at university, which actually I'm quite grateful for now, because it at least I know how to use them to a certain degree. But I don't need much more than that. As long as I've got access to historical data, then that's really much more important to me.
So
I think a lot of people. Yeah, sorry.
So those getting started can, not be necessarily afraid of, how am I going to compete with all those other bettors out there, because they have all these models that have been developed over years and years, and they're tweaking them. Some people talk about tweaking them every single day for a few hours to update. It doesn't need to be such a tough.
I think now as well, that sort of thing is going to go more out of the window, because machine learning is becoming more and more advanced as well. So I'm sure that someone with a lot of financial resources and a lot of sort of programming skills could teach expensive program to do that sort of thing automatically anyway. No, I mean, more so is I've got the model, and basically then I'll use that to define prices and projected hold percentages and stuff like that. But that's based on the inputs that I put into the model, and then maybe during the off season I look at the model and see if there's any changes, and maybe make some very small tweaks to it. But it's not every single day that I would do that.
Okay. You mentioned the Elo model. For those who don't know what that is, do you want to just take us through that and what that means?
Yeah, so basically that was designed, I think, by a guy who used it in a chess context to start with. And basically it gives, say if you beat the world number one. Look at it from a tennis context, right? So let's pick out a guy who's like average-ish kind of player. So look at Kyle Edmund, roughly ranked 30, 40, 50 roughly in the last year. If he was to be Roger Federer, he would get more points on that system than if he beat, I don't know, Nicolas Almagro, who's not nearly as highly rated as Federer. So a bigger win, a win against a better player would give you more credit and therefore improve your rating, which I was then able to reflect as a price. So I'd have a rating for each player for each surface, and then that would convert into a price. I think they use that model as well for like stuff like video games and stuff like that, like online rankings. And I think it's quite widely spread now as a ranking system.
And does that imply a higher upside or a higher ceiling for that player? What's the rationale?
So basically, it would just be like a current rating at that particular time, which I would then weight for recency. So I did a bit of research about what sort of weighting you should put on recent results compared to older results. And I think there's a model that someone has got online commercial at the moment, but from my experience, he puts too much weighting on historical results. So like he overrates players like David Ferrer, for example, who has declined significantly. So the problem with using really old results, I'm talking especially over a year ago, is that it fails to take into account considerable improvements or declines in players. So if you've got a guy who's like in his mid to late, anything from sort of over 30 onwards, and he shows a decline in stats, then I would say that's likely to be pretty terminal, or at least he's going to be going close to his way out. There's very few players who can turn that around at that age. There's been a few, but on the whole, that doesn't happen. And so basically, his results from 2 years ago I couldn't care less about because they're not relevant to his current situation. But then on the same side, you could say, a younger player who's like 18, 19, 20, 21, players tend to do most of their improvement by the age of 22. If you might want to look at more sort of 6-month data rather than 12-month data because of the fact that they're improving quite quickly. But then you need to obviously make sure that their improvement isn't down to variance necessarily, as opposed to being, an actual genuine improvement.
A quick note from our friends at Betfair. Ready for a different way of thinking? Unlike other operators, Betfair wants you to win. On the Betfair Hub, you'll unlock market-leading insights, strategies, models, and more. Master the game within the game. And join today at betfair.com.au with promo code BOBPOD. Please gamble responsibly. So before we get to the betting stuff, I want to talk about some of the information and I guess tennis analytics that you use. When I did a little bit of research and wanted to understand more about tennis, I saw some of the things you were talking about, and it's a little bit different language with court speed and hold percentage and break percentage and stuff like that. What are some of the main ones that you use?
Yeah, okay. So primarily you would want to look at a way of grading players' ability to hold serve, which would then translate into a price. Now you can use hold percentage and break percentage across the surface for the server and the returner. So obviously, if John Isner's playing against Ivo Karlovic, two massive servers, then you're going to want to take Karlovic's return tendencies into account when calculating Isner's likely hold percentage. So obviously, if Isner's playing Nadal, who's a much better returner than Karlovic, then his projected hold percentage will be considerably lower because he's playing against a player who's a much better returner. So you would take into account that. You could also look at service points won and return points won percentages as opposed to hold and break percentages as well. That's fine. That's fine too. Regarding court speed, I find that there's a lot of fallacies with court speed, and I still get into arguments with people a lot on social media about this type of thing. So with court speed, it's important to say I don't really care why a court is fast or slow, but generally that there's always the same tendencies as to why this occurs. So, for example, when I say a court's fast, I'm talking relatively based according to the mean. So, for example, let's look at clay tournaments played at altitude, for example, such as in South America. There's tournaments on clay or hard court in Quito and Bogota. They're played at extreme altitude, so the conditions at that venue are very, very fast because the air is thin, and therefore it improves makes the serve come through faster. And the same in Madrid as well, to a lesser extent. Always in those three venues, the hole percentage is much higher than the average for that relevant surface. So that shows that I do understand the reasons why, but I'm not really interested in the reasons why. I'm just looking for a trend that can be exploited. It's important for people maybe who don't follow tennis that regularly to understand that the authorities use quite generic descriptions about courts. So a hard court, they'll say, okay, the event's played on a hard court, but what they don't tell you is that there's several court manufacturers as well who manufacture that hard court, and each will have their own tendency. They also don't discuss necessarily the fact that they're using different types of balls at one tournament and not at another tournament, and that they also have their own tendencies as well. But all rolled in together with the atmospheric conditions and the court manufacturers and the ball manufacturers, then it comes out that more often than not, it's the same tournaments who have a higher percentage of service holds, and also a higher percentage of aces served as well, which is another good marker compared to other tournaments which don't. So you can make clear assumptions, and those numbers can be reflected in projected hold percentages as well. And those things are very, very important to note, and I think that a lot of people don't appreciate quite how important that they are.
So how do you go about quantifying these different pieces? Because obviously, we know that Nadal's very, very good on clay, for example, and all this type of stuff is probably clear. But I guess the hardest part and what makes it so interesting is that you need to try and put a value on them. How do you think about, assigning different values? Obviously, it sounds like hold percentage is one of the key components. That's one of the main pillars you use. Is it going through individually and assigning values to different variables?
That's pretty much exactly it. So I'll look at each player's statistics on that relevant surface, and Nadal obviously has got better stats on clay because it's his best surface. So it kind of draws its own conclusion that's corrected by definition, basically. So his stats pretty much every year are much better on clay than they are, say, on hard court, and in particular the faster conditions as well, which would be grass or indoor hard. So yeah, these things are automatically reflected in the numbers that I can then plug into the model, which would then generate prices and projected hold percentages, etc.
And what about subjective factors? How do you go about thinking about those, whether it's momentum and fatigue and some of these things that are very, very difficult to quantify?
I think momentum a lot of the time is a bit overrated. I mean, tennis is, as well as other sports, is a sport of quite fine margins, and a shot that on a break point, which is millimeters out, on another day it could be millimeters in, and the match has got completely different. Is heading in a completely different direction. Momentum as well in terms of tournaments and form. I think a lot of the time it's really quite. It can also be described as positive variance. Key point conversion or saving break points, for example, is key when looking at short-term momentum and form. I think a lot of it's quite overrated. Fatigue is an interesting one. So you've got two different types of fatigue, really. You've got the short-term fatigue, which might be a guy's won a tournament and he's played like 5 matches in 6 days, and then he's had to fly off and play first round in another tournament. Well, I'm assuming that guy is going to be more tired than the average player, whereas the market actually often interprets it as more of a positive and will say, okay, well, the guy's banging form. Well, we disagree there somewhat often. But then you've also got the longer term fatigue as well, the second type of fatigue, which, for example, would be afflicting Dominic Thiem. So for those of you guys who are unaware, Dominic Thiem is a top 10 Austrian tennis player in the ATP top 10. And he has a coach who basically pushes him. And I think he likes pushing himself as well. Trains a lot. He plays a lot. And the problem is that if you look at the schedules of every single other top 10 player practically, especially the elite four, historically, Murray, Federer, Djokovic and Nadal, they all play much fewer tournaments than, say, anyone outside the top 10. And what they also do is that they avoid cross-continental travel in quick succession as much as they possibly can. So, for example, if Federer is playing a tournament in Australia or America, there's no chance that he's going to play a tournament in Europe the following week. Absolutely no chance, because he understands the effects that it has on his body. Team does not understand this. So he'll play, I think in February this year, he played 3 tournaments in consecutive weeks in 3 different continents. And there's absolutely no way that that's beneficial for the guy. And if you look at his results post-US Open, so in September, October, November, every year for the last 3 years, when he's been ranked in the top 20 every single year, he's winning about 35% of those matches. That's it. And he's heavy favourite in practically every single one. Yeah. So that's all due to the fact that he's played considerably more matches than other players, and he's done a hell of a lot more travelling as well. So that's the long-term fatigue as well. Other subjective factors, head-to-head, is something that needs to be factored into some extent, although it's really, really, really important to look a bit deeper than, say, a exact head-to-head scoreline. So I'll give you some examples. So yesterday we saw at Tour Finals, Federer played against Jack Sock. Well, Federer went into the match 3-0 leading head-to-head, 6-0 leading in sets. You'd say that's pretty dominant, but then Federer's a heavy favourite in every single one of them, so you'd have to bear that in mind as well. However, what we'd also say is that looking at the match stats for those matches, Sock had only created 2 break points on Federer's serve across 6 sets, which is woeful. So it looks like he finds it really hard to deal with Federer's serve. And in fact, in yesterday's match, 6-4, 7-6, it sounded close, but Federer had all the break points. Sock didn't have a single one. So Sock actually now had 2 break points in 8 sets against Federer. So I'm assuming now that Federer's serve is just too hot to handle for Sock, or he can't get a good read on it. And you would then be able to factor that into some form of calculation as well. What I don't like is when the media trot out head-to-heads as if it's like some meaningful statistic, like leading 3-2 or 2-1 or 1-0, even 2-0. It's absolutely irrelevant.
Yeah.
Like I say, tennis is a sport of thin margins. And actually, I know a player, an ex-player, he was in the top 10 previously. He's now retired. And he said to me that he had a negative head-to-head against one particular player. And I think he said it was 7-0 head-to-head deficit against one particular guy. But he said in those matches, he had like match point in 2 or 3 of them. He was like set and break up in a couple of them as well. And every single match was close. And he said he never went on court thinking he was beaten before that match started, because he knew that despite how dominant the head-to-head looked, he was in massive spots in a ton of those matches. Yep. So it's really, really important to look at the context of those head-to-heads. If it's like more than 2-3 years old, I'm not really giving it too much respect, particularly if one of the players has particularly changed his level in more recent times. So it's really important to guard against overvaluing a head-to-head, but then also giving it the respect that it deserves at the right times as well.
Let's talk betting. So once you've crunched all your numbers and you've evaluated the players in the match and the conditions and everything else, and you probably spit out a price, what's your general approach to betting, or what's your strategy once you've done all that? What are you thinking about?
Yeah, so generally, let's say you would have the raw data, and then you're going to look at creating a script for the matches. So by that I would mean preparing yourself for various eventualities that the match would take. So, for example, I'll have data on a player's ability to retain break leads, to recover break deficits, and in conjunction with looking at the established projected hold percentages and market versus model pricing that I've established prior to the match starts, and then also the match stats in play as well. And you can take a view in play, and obviously you've got that preparation in advance with the script, so you know that if player X is leading player Y at a given point that you've established previously, then if the match stats also indicate that it's a viable to enter as well as the, obviously the preconditions that you've established in advance of the match, then you can enter the market.
So everything's pretty settled for you in your mind heading into a match, and you sort of know what to look for?
Yeah, so I think it's really, really important to look at trying to automate that process as much as possible, because obviously human mentality is quite weak, and it's easy to if you don't have that script and be quite organised before the match starts, to deviate from a mentality. Obviously, like you can be a weak person mentally could be influenced by a commentator or posts on social media, or there's a lot of different situations they could tilt because they've lost several trades earlier in the day, and then they put money. They throw good money after bad. So it's really important to try and avoid those situations and try and be as sort of robotic as possible, but then also be able to react to the match situations. Be sort of robotic and flexible, I guess, is the best way to describe it.
So are the markets relatively efficient in tennis, and maybe Federer and Nadal versus a challenger match or a first round Grand Slam match?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. So basically, looking at a really general basis, a latter stage match in a high profile tournament, so for example a Masters or a Slam, will be a lot more efficiently priced and a lot more efficiently evaluated by the market than maybe a first round in a 250 or a challenger or even 500 level events. Generally speaking, the market will become more efficient later on in the tournament, but by the same token, it also kind of, I think, from my perspective, at least my point of view, is more related. It gives too much credence to form. So that's where I try and look for discrepancies is one main area. So generally speaking, the more high profile the tournament, the more high profile the players, the more likely the match is to be efficient because more people in the market know about those players' tendencies.
So take us through a typical day. Let's say it's French Open, day one. You got inside courts with games playing, outside courts. There's a lot going on. You've mentioned you sort of try and make things as automated as possible, but just take us through, you sitting down in front of probably 4 or 5 different screens. What's that like? So
Grand Slams is you picked an interesting day to analyze straight away, because Grand Slams, obviously the first day of Grand Slams is utterly brutal. So for those who don't know, there's, assuming that all the matches are played, there's 32 men's and 32 women's matches on the first day of a Grand Slam, and then the same on the second as well. And after 4 days of a Grand Slam, 96 matches across in each of the 2 tournaments are played. So pretty much that's ballpark 3/4 of the matches are played in a tournament are played in the first 4 days. So it's impossible to cover every single match on that basis. And in a Grand Slam as well, like, liquidity is much thinner because the volume of matches in the first few days is so high. So in a slam, the key for me would be to focus on the particular matches that you feel that the edge is greatest on. So don't look to cover every single match, but just pick out the ones that you think that have got the highest value from a trading perspective. So you make a short list of them after with slams. The draws are usually announced on like a Friday before a Sunday or Monday start. I think the French Open starts on a Sunday and every other slam starts on a Monday. And you'd have all the data in advance, so you can prepare the script well in advance, and then just looking to get immersed when the situations dictate. But like I said, focusing on the matches that you think have got the most value is key for day 1, day 2 of a slam in particular.
What percentage of your bets, it sounds like, if any, are pre-game bets?
Yeah, not much these days. There's a few, but not much on the whole.
Was it always like that for you?
No, because like I said at the start, when I built the Elo model, it was all pre-game, and then obviously with the account restrictions, etc., then that's when I moved into more of a trading basis. So yeah, primarily in play. Well, what generally happens in tennis is that it's not always the case, but mostly is that if a player's value pre-match, then that value will also be able to be interpreted in play as well. Yeah. So generally speaking, like, the market will be based on 2 different factors, which is the starting price of the 2 players and the current scoreline. And so therefore, if the starting price I believe is out on a player pre-match, then it's likely to be out on a player in play as well. And then obviously you can take a view on that basis too.
So was Betfair always around when you were doing even the Elo model, or was that something that sort of...
Yeah, Betfair was around then. But like I said, I literally was just focusing on a pre-match basis. So,
okay.
when I was doing that, I was obviously taking advantage of soft books prices where I could before I got restricted. Bet with Pinnacle as well prior to their exclusion from the UK market, and just basically whoever offered the best price, I would and available that was available at that time, and I was able to get my given stake on, I would use. But I was also very aware of, for example, of bookmaker rules regarding retirement. And believe it or not, when I actually started, I emailed every single bookmaker asking for a copy of their retirement rules.
Well, it probably makes a difference. 1 or 2 matches a year is a problem.
Right, marginal gains. Yeah. So for example, if I knew a player had like fitness concerns and stuff, then I might take a couple of ticks less at a given bookmaker, depending on what bet I would want to get on, and I would try and manipulate the system a few times like that, and which pays off in the long term. You put the extra work in and you look for those marginal gains. It usually reflects itself in the bottom line eventually.
So take us through a match. If you sort of allocate a match as a match you really want to get involved with, what are some of your thoughts as the match starts? Are you picking certain positions? Are you hedging out of all your bets? Take us through sort of how you approach it.
A lot of people will, and it sounds like kind of you as well from that question, will think that I'm in and out, in and out, in and out, in and out, and it doesn't really happen like that. So more so, it'll be just picking like 1, 2, 3 positions in a match where you feel like your edge is greatest, and you're in, and then ideally, obviously, if the trade goes your way, then you're out. And obviously, if it doesn't go your way, then you're going to want to have to hedge negatively at some point as well. So it's certainly not like a situation where I'm like, I'm not scalping, I'm not going in like all the time. I'm just looking at situations across the match, and like some matches you might pre-identify various situations that the match wants to go, that you want the sort of path that you want the match to take, but it doesn't manifest itself, and you might just have no entry on the match. It's really difficult to specify amount of trades that you put in a match, but on the whole, it's not that many. Okay,
so you're more than happy to back your position or opinion, even though, or it may be pretty clear to you that it's going to change in a positive direction. You're happy just to stay on that?
Yeah. So basically, like generally speaking, I a lot of the trades that I like are quite momentum. I oppose momentum. So generally, I find that I'm looking for players who maybe can't hold on to a lead, or the other way around, like they're going to bail themselves out of a bad spot if they're on serve, or trading like very short-term swings in tie breaks and stuff like that. So like opposing a dominant leader in a tie break where the risk is really, really low, but the reward can be quite high given situations, especially like final set tie break, for example. So generally speaking, like I said, I oppose momentum. I think it's overrated by both the market, and that's also something that's very, very apparent in the media and in TV commentary as well. So if you watch tennis matches on TV, you'll find that there's one clear characteristic of the commentator, and that is that they always want to look right. So because of that, they always overvalue the player who's leading. And so therefore they'll give him all sorts of praise and credit where it's not necessarily due. And then the player who's losing, they're not going to focus on, or they're going to be a bit more disparaging towards. And then suddenly the guy comes back, which hopefully I've called, and the commentator then thinks they're the greatest thing since Roger Federer. So it's like it's apparent with sort of society, and like I said in the commentary as well, people want to be right, and that means that more often than not they have to they're looking to be side with the front runner. So
is there a feasible or viable corporate bookmaking market out there for in play, or are you always going to Betfair and going to exchanges to try and...
Yeah, exchanges I think is where it's at. I think that there's definitely sort of steps that people are, some bookmakers are taking to try and become a bit more, operate with a bit more integrity regarding account restrictions, and being able to lay a bet as long as you're not arbing, which is fantastic. So I mean, but I think it's going to be a long time before anything really sort of across the board in the market occurs. And I think obviously we've got the fixed odds betting terminals issues in the UK as well at the moment, which is going to dramatically affect it has a potential to dramatically affect the bookmakers' model, because they derive such a big proportion of their profits from these fixed odds betting terminals. If the government was to considerably reduce the stake on them, which is being debated at the moment, then they would have to look to derive more income from their bookmaking side of things, and therefore either just market and advertise just non-stop, or they're going to have to look at the way that they operate and make those changes that where necessary. So I think we're in a bit of a fluid market. I still think that there's a massive scope for competition. But the problem is, obviously, with exchanges, it's a bit of a chicken and egg situation. So people aren't going to go to an exchange that has no liquidity.
Yeah.
So it's tough on that basis. But I definitely think that there's scope for more market entries and an improved market offering from a number of participants.
So what would happen if Betfair was, taxed or regulated out of the market? Would that just blow up in completely the whole sort of tennis trading situation?
Yeah, there probably would be like the new Black Friday. But it is what it is. Ever since, like I said earlier, ever since I played machines, I always try and have a backup plan or future plans in mind, because I think that's just a smart thing to do. And oftentimes I've found that in my life so far, I'm 38 now, that these backup plans are great to have and they serve me really well, but often they're not needed for many, many years. And with machines, I was always thinking to myself, right, okay, I need to get something sorted out, because this could end in 3 months' time. But it didn't really manifest itself for a decade or more. So often these things aren't worth worrying about too much until they happen, as long as you've got a kind of backup plan in mind. I don't see it happening, and I'll tell you why. Because primarily the UK government are very keen to maintain things that derive them considerable tax revenue. So bookmaking or exchanges, or however you want to describe it, derives them considerable tax revenue, and therefore they're unlikely to change it.
So I want to talk staking and money management. How much of your time do you spend on thinking about it with regards to, bet sizing, calculating your edge, applying Kelly for those who use the Kelly criterion? Is that a key component of what you're up to?
Okay, so I don't use Kelly strictly, and as a staking strategy, generally it's quite an aggressive one. So most people use like a derivative of it, like a quarter Kelly or something like that. Primarily, I got served quite well from my poker background, because in poker, to give you guys a bit of an insight into how money management will be used in poker, cash games, they say that the guideline is that you should have 40 to 50 buy-ins to play at a cash table. So, for example, let's say that you were having the buy-ins were buy-in would be $200, 100 big blinds, so be a $1, $2 table. Then your bankroll would need to be 8,000 to 10,000 to play at that stake. Because and then so max, if you got stacked by someone, you'd be losing like 2 to 2.5% of your bankroll. So it's a very sustainable thing, and the short-term variance doesn't hit you that hard. And I transferred that over to trading. So basically, looking when I first started with the betting model, I looked to lose no more than about 2 to 2.5% of my bankroll on a given bet. And I also did a similar sort of thing with in play as well now. So that's really, really important that people have a good money management strategy, because I get emailed countless times by people who don't. And people even email me and say, look, they've only got £500 to invest, but they don't want to win less than £100 on a trade. Well, that's the road to the poorhouse, because everyone has losing runs. So it's impossible for them to look to turn a trade unless they get insanely lucky early on in their trading career. Regarding Kelly, like you said earlier, obviously the basis of Kelly is that the more edge you perceive that you have, the more you're going to stake. And I kind of have that's all factored into my script. So it's not Kelly, but it's like my own version of it, basically, in the context that I need it to be, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. One more thing I wanted to touch on before I let you go: specialization. could you be a positive expectation value tennis and football trader, or tennis and cricket, or can you even do it within tennis? I know there's a lot of matches and there's a lot of players out there. There's obviously women's, there's men's, and there's challenges and all that sort of stuff. What's your opinion or thoughts on the aspect of specialization?
Yeah, it depends really. It depends how much time and experience that you have that you want to throw at something. So tennis for me is pretty resource and time intensive. So I'm spending hours and hours a day, obviously in that world. I've looked at cricket. Obviously, I said previously I looked at football. Also, I looked at darts a little bit as well. But to get yourself to a level where you're extremely competent in that sport, it does take a lot of time. People say that you need to, the 1,000 or 10,000 hour rule of competence, that people you have to do something for a certain amount of time to and that's definitely true. But obviously, if you've got experience in one sport, then there's definitely some transferable skills. But I think it's really, really difficult tennis is a good sport because it's runs for 11 months of the year. There's usually matches on every single day at various times, so it suits people who maybe don't have time to trade all day. But it's also quite demanding on those who do trade full time or analysts or whatever. So it's difficult. It's difficult to look at other sports, but I think maybe one sport maximum in conjunction with another sport would be ideal. So then obviously you could look to do the other sport when there's less of a schedule for your preferred sport. But I wouldn't. Anyone who can trade like multiple sports, like more than two at the same time, hats off to them, because I think that's really difficult. And maybe they've got sources in other sports instead. The other people give them a heads up, or they've got like some like team of programmers, like the sports hedge fund companies in London, for example. Syndicates, they've got people looking at all different sports for them, and they've got the resources, they've got the financial resources, they've got the time resources on that basis because they're employing people to do it. But an individual, I think it's really hard to focus on more than two sports. Obviously in tennis we've got the ATP, WTA, Challengers, ITFs, and you've also got doubles as well. ITFs and doubles, the liquidity is really, really bad, so I don't really bother with even looking at them. And Challengers, the liquidity depends considerably on whether the match is streamed and also the time of the day as well. So you can do challenges, ATP, WTA, all kind of in conjunction with each other, and I feel is absolutely fine. But like you say, WTA and ATP is almost like trading two different sports as it is, because there's such different dynamics in each one. So yeah, it's a pretty busy world in tennis.
Oh yes. So 45 minutes of chatting, it all comes down to one thing. Who is Dan Weston's greatest tennis player of the last 25 years?
Oh God, that's a really hard question to answer.
I was thinking through myself, and I thought, oh yeah, you mentioned Djokovic and obviously Federer and Nadal, and all the Aussies out there know about Leighton Hewitt. He's probably not in this discussion, but there's a few decent players who have played.
Hewitt certainly, yeah, he's not quite in that level, but he was a great player, obviously. I think from the way that he carries himself and the success that he's had, and the number of slams that he's had across all surfaces, really, apart from clay, Federer is going to be tough to beat from that discussion. Nadal obviously is completely up there as well, but obviously the bulk of his success has been on clay. So perhaps if he'd done a bit more on grass as well, in particular, then he would have more right. But I would go with Federer. But pre-injury, I was pretty convinced that Djokovic would overtake both of them. So really, really interesting to see how Djokovic comes back next season, because if he's still got the fire and he's still got he can maintain the level that he was prior to his layoff, then I think he's going to usurp both of them.
One other thing before I let you go, and I really appreciate you coming on, Dan. What resources do you look out for? Have you got any books or podcasts or newsletters, things like that may be interesting for some of the listeners?
Not really. I read stuff on social media, like people's posts and stuff, and I'd rather read like an article than a podcast or a book or other people's opinions on a match. So I'm more looking towards like reading about players and their interviews and stuff as opposed to resources and stuff. Back in the day, I used to look at forums and stuff quite a lot, and there were some really good posters back in the olden days, and they definitely helped me along with my process. But nowadays, I don't really look at a lot of that sort of stuff. But I just try and immerse myself in numbers, and I listen to the podcasts that I listen to would be more like betting focus. So I found obviously your podcast previously, and I listened to a lot of them, and I found that a lot of them did have transferable skills that I could look at, or gave me new ideas to approach various problems that I didn't have before. But on the whole, like, I don't find that there's that many great podcasts to look at. So check out you, but I don't really know about many others, really.
So where can people find you on social media, or obviously your website? What's the best way for them to be in contact or see what you're up to?
Yeah, so basically I'm on Twitter @tennisratings. You can drop me an email anytime at tennistrades@gmail.com, and check out the website, which is www.tennisratings.co.uk.
Awesome, Dan. Thank you very much for your time. It was great to have a chat about tennis, and much appreciated.
I really enjoyed it, Jake. Take care.
This podcast is proudly sponsored by Betfair Proprietary Limited. Betfair operates a betting exchange and is licensed in the Northern Territory of Australia. The Betfair exchange isn't a house that sets the odds. It's betting at its purest. One punter's opinion against another's. Play the game within the game and join today. Residents of Australia can join Betfair by visiting betfair.com.au, and please support this podcast by using promo code BOBPOD. Gamble responsibly.